Marhaba wa ahla wasahla. In this session we'll be talking about the present tense, and hopefully I'll give you a clearer guide to the present tense in Levantine Arabic. Here we have to understand that in Levantine Arabic we've got three main present tenses. Regarding the present tense, in Levantine Arabic we've got three most commonly used present tenses. The first one is the b-prefix. The b-prefix, I'd like to highlight that this is just purely a dialect creation. What do we mean by the b-prefix? The b-prefix is literally every conjugation that starts with the letter B for bravo. When do we use it? Well, we use it to talk about habitual activities, things that we do on a daily basis, like daily routines. I go, بروح, I see, بشوف, and so on. Our second tense is the subjunctive. The subjunctive, we're going to look at it later in a separate video. Third, we've got the present continuous. These are the main ones, and as well we're going to look at them in a separate video just to highlight it a little bit more and for you to practice. Obviously we do have some more other tenses which I have made a video with 12 tenses, conjugating a verb on 12 tenses. But that's not our topic. Our topic here is the three main present tenses in Levantine Arabic. The present tense is easy as long as you know that in Arabic we do have three main forms. These forms, they make the three triliteral root verbs. I know it sounds a little bit difficult for you to know which verb goes under what form, but this is something you don't really need to worry about because I conjugate verbs for you on a weekly basis, and all you need to do is just to practice it, listen to it, and a number of times in your learning cycle you need to conjugate at least 200 verbs before you become at an independent level. What is the present tense? The present tense is mostly revolves around a prefix which is an attachment you added before the verb. And for some other subject pronouns we do have a suffix you add it to the end of the verb, such as with you feminine, they and you group of people. We've got one more tiny little thing with the present tense. The present tense is not only about a prefix and a suffix. When you bring a verb such as katab, which means to write, when you conjugate it with the present tense and you know that the prefix for I is b, here katab has two vowel r in between every consonant. Well, when you make the present tense, the first consonant gets deleted or becomes a silent, and the second vowel which comes before the last letter, that's where we need to talk, and that changes depending on the verb form. Later on I'll give you some examples to help you understand this a bit more. So the second vowel changes and it becomes an u here, so it becomes biktob. So there's a big difference between katab, to write, and buktob, which means I write. So again, it's not just about a prefix and a suffix only, but you need to still change the voweling of the verb in order to make it into the present tense, and that is purely and merely depends on the type of the form that we're going to look at it. In addition to what I've mentioned earlier, we do have irregular verbs. These irregular verbs, we do have some little bit more work in addition to the previous one. For example, if we do have an irregular verb, some of these weak letters do change or get deleted. So it's a little bit more extra work. And as well to the previous one, the vowels do change. Predominantly the second vowel change within a verb. Thirdly, you need to get your conjugation right. If we know all of this and we don't get the right conjugation, if you're talking to you masculine, then you conjugate it with we, then we wouldn't know who's undertaking the activity. So here there are a number of things to take in consideration and understand it. In Arabic we've got some forms. These three forms are mainly regular, but obviously we do have irregular forms. With regular forms, all you need to do is just to add the right prefix and suffix, and obviously the second vowel of each verb that changes depending on the verb. In addition to that, with irregular verbs, you need to change some of the weak letters that do change. and later I'll be explaining on that a little bit more. Finally, don't worry about all the above because I'm going to explain this in greater details for you guys, so hopefully you understand a bit more. But most importantly, because I do conjugate verbs on a weekly basis, so hopefully these verbs would give you a more practical practice rather than giving you the theory. The practical practice, it does help more, and all you need to do is just to again go and listen to a number of times and practice it when possible. And again, there are a number of theories and practices around learning languages, but what works best with Arabic is as little as often. Repetition do work and practice makes perfect. Now we'll be talking about verb forms in Arabic, and the first form is fa'ula yaf'ulu. Fa'ula yaf'ulu for you guys, it doesn't mean anything and I wouldn't memorize it. As an example, we've got sharufa yashrufu. Sharufa yashrufu, which means to appear. And here, as you see the voweling of the form, that would give you an idea. So fa'ula, that would be the past, and yaf'ulu would be the present tense, meaning the second vowel. Here is the second vowel which I'm talking about. So sharufa yashrufu. Most of the times the first letter of the verb, for example here, it's a vowel a, but when you conjugate it becomes a silent, and this is what I mentioned earlier. And here the vowel here is an u, and here it's lucky that actually stayed u, because I'd like to say that not every verb the second vowel would change, because most of them do stay the same. The second form is fa'ila yaf'alu. Fa'ila yaf'alu, and again it's a form. If you doesn't mean anything, and I just wrote it for you as a grammatical reference so you could refer to it or at least to know it, but you don't have to use it at all. And alima fa'ila, so fa'ila, that's the past tense form, and alima, which means to know. And the present form of fa'ila is yaf'alu. Yaf'alu, yaf'alu. So here again, the first letter here is now become consonant, because before it was a vowel, and the letter before the last here, it was a vowel and now has become a vowel a. And we've got alima, which is to know, alima, and when it becomes the present tense, the ha, as you see here, when you conjugate it becomes a second letter within this verb, and there becomes a silent, and the letter before the last, which is the L here, it's a vowel now has become a vowel a. And this is an example when I mean the vowel on the letter before the last that changes. And here is an example that changed from vowel for elephant to an a for apple. So that's an example. Our third form is fa'ala yaf'alu, and again this is a pattern. It does not mean anything, it's just a pattern, and within it contains a number of irregular verbs. The first one is initial week. Initial week is every verb that starts with a wow, or in some textbooks it's called assimilated verbs. Wa'ada ya'ad. Wa'ada ya'ad, and what does that mean? Well, the wow gets deleted, as you see, and here is being replaced with a ya, which is the conjugation for he, third person. But again, this is not an issue in dialect, because people in dialect, they tend to keep the wow if they wish, and some people tend to delete it, going with the standard grammar. Our second type of verbs within the third form is called the middle week, which so far I've conjugated lots of verbs on this form. قال يقول and باع يبيع. It's a middle week verb, and the middle week verb could be either two types, either an e root or an u root. What do we mean by that? We've got the verb قال, and it's a middle week verb, and it has an alif or a in the middle. That alif in the root is an u. What does that mean? It means that the alif becomes an u in the present tense, plus you need to add your prefix and suffix. And in dialect, people tend to replace the letter qaf with a glottal stop. So say al yi'ul, and this is a middle week verb, u rooted or u root. We do have an e root as well, like ba, which means to sell, ba, which means to sell. So this is a middle week verb, has an alif in the middle, and that alif in the root, it's an e. The alif becomes an e when you conjugate the present tense with all tenses and I'll show you that later. Ba يبيع, ba يبيع. Our third type of irregular verbs that goes under this form is called final week. And the final week again here could be an E root and an U root. What does that mean? These both verbs ends with an alif at the end. But this one, it has an E root, meaning the R becomes an E when you conjugate it with the present and the past tense. And on the other side, because it's an U root, da'a, bid'u, or yid'u, the R gets replaced with an U. It's just because of the type of the verb. Here, it's a final week E root or an U root. So here we've got a final week verb and ends with an R, and similarly the other one ends with an R, but we have to remember that one of these verbs is an E root and the other one is an U root. When we conjugate the first one in the present tense, the R becomes an E, and the second one, when we conjugate it with the present, the R becomes an U. The third form has two more irregular verbs. The first one we call a hamzated verbs. The clue is within the title, meaning it has a hamza within the verb. Sa'al, yis'al, qara, yaqra. And here there's absolutely no issue here. Obviously in modern Arabic, it has got some grammatical cases related to this. However, in dialect, you should not worry at all because you could go ahead and conjugate it as normal without any issues. The final irregular verb that goes within the same third form is called doubled verbs. What is a doubled verb? A doubled verb, it's what looks like it's a two-letter verb with a shadda on the last letter. In fact, it's a three-letter. But we know in Arabic, if you see here shadda on top of a letter, that means we've got two letters of the same, but they join them together and they write shadda on the top of it. So han, which means to miss, yahan, and the verb here, han, yahan, rad, yirad. Han, yahan, han, which means to miss, rad, which means to answer or to reply. And again, I'd like to say in modern standard Arabic, it has a very specific grammar related to this. However, the good news in dialect, that grammar doesn't apply and you could go ahead and conjugate it as a regular verb. So you could say hannait, bahan, and raddait, brid, and so on. So again, there's no issue with these two types of verbs and you could go ahead and conjugate it as a normal regular verb. Now, let's have a look at the examples with the present tense. I've conjugated previously with the past tense, which we've looked at again, and you've got the transliteration here and the translation. So the verb is katab, katab, which means to write. As we know, the present tense is all about a prefix, which I've highlighted it in the color red. With I always, I would add a ba. So ana, which means I would always add a ba before any verb. Then the meaning will change to I. You masculine, bata. You feminine, you'll add the same as you masculine, but you should end it with an E, because that's how we distinguish between you feminine and you masculine. With we have to add bina. With you group of people, you will add bata and end it with an U. With he third person, we'll have to add biya. With she third person, it has the same conjugation as you masculine, bata, pretty much the same. You might think that's confusing. I think that's a good news, because now you could memorize one conjugation and you could be used for two people. Finally, they group of people, you have to add biya and you should end it with an U. But first of all, the verb katab, katab, has two vowel R's in the middle. As I previously stated, when you add a prefix for the present tense, the first letter, as you see here, becomes a consonant. And the second vowel is where we need to focus and pay attention to, because the second vowel is not the same in all verbs. So we say بكتب, أنت بتكتب, بتكتبي, بنكتب, بتكتبوا بيكتب بتكتب بيكتبوا. I'd like to say that again. This is an example of a regular verb conjugation. And what would happen? I'd like to highlight that what you see in red, it will be repeated and added to any verb. But what we need to work on is the second vowel, which is the vowel before the last letter, because it changes depending on the verb. If it's regular and if it's irregular, you need to pay attention to the vowel before the last and the weak letter. Now let's have a look at this example on a middle weak verb. On this side, you see the past tense conjugated, which I've highlighted in the previous video, talking about the past tense. Now we'll look at on the other side, which we call it the present tense. Here there are two things to take in consideration. The first thing is this is a middle weak verb, an u root, meaning the alif or r, we have to replace it with an u in all conjugations, plus your standard prefix and suffix. أنا بقول، أنت بتقول، أنتي بتقولي، نحنا we بنقول، أنتو you group of people بتقولوا، هو بيقول، هي بتقول، هن بيقولوا. So what are the changes that happened here? First, we've added the red prefix and suffix for the present tense. The second thing, because this verb is a middle weak u root, the alif has been replaced with an u in all conjugation, and this is an example of a middle weak verb u root. Here we've got a middle weak verb and it's e-rooted and it's a middle weak verb. The alif gets deleted in the past tense with the first person, second person, as you see here, and with the third person that alif comes back again. But you have to remember you need to add your red suffix color as you see here to the verb, because without it the conjugation doesn't mean anything. However, in the present tense we've got two things. First, you have to replace the alif or the r with the letter e, because this verb is an e-rooted or an e-root verb. Then we need to remember to add the appropriate conjugation, and here it's highlighted in red, the prefix, and some of them do end with a suffix. So that's how we distinguish between who's undertaking the action. Again, this is an e-root middle weak verb. What I would like you to note here, as we have the letter E here and it's a very strong letter in Arabic, therefore there is no need to worry about the second vowel or the vowel before the last letter, because the letter E is very strong, therefore it overrides any voweling there. So it's very obvious and I wouldn't worry about it, especially with middle weak verbs. And in this section I'll be taking you through an e-root final weak verb. What does that mean? The R becomes an E in past and present tense. In this side, as you see, this is the conjugation for the past tense, where you will see and spot an extra E. And the reason being is because this is a final weak verb and it's an E root. The R gets replaced with an E plus your standard suffix past tense conjugation. On the other side, you'll see the same verb conjugated with the present tense. What do we notice here? We notice an extra E. Why? Because the verb haka is a final weak verb and it's an E root, meaning the R gets changed or replaced with an E. أنا بحكي، أنت بتحكي، أنت بتحكي، نحن بنحكي، أنتو بتحكوا، هو بيحكي، هي بتحكي، هن بيحكوا. What did we notice here? The R has been replaced with an E in all subject pronouns. Like, أنا بحكي أنت بتحكي نحن بنحكي هو بيحكي and هي بتحكي. However, if one of these conjugations do have a suffix, such as you feminine and you group of people and they all do have a suffix. Therefore, the suffix takes the place of the irregular letter. That's why the conjugation for you masculine and you feminine is pretty much the same, because the E gets deleted and the suffix for you feminine is an E. That's why. However, this becomes a lot clearer about the deletion of the E when you look at the conjugation for you group of people and they. So you would say أنتم بتحكوا. What happened to the E which is being used instead of the R? Well, because the present tense for you group of people and they has a suffix similarly to you feminine. Then we replace it completely, so we would say أنتم بتحكوا and هن بيحكوا. To summarize this, if a final weak verb ends with an R, that R could be an E rooted. If you want to conjugate it in the present tense, you replace that R with an E with all subject pronouns with all conjugations. Except if a conjugation has a suffix such as you feminine, you group of people, they, then the suffix takes the priority and it takes the place for an E and the E gets deleted. In this section, we'll be looking at the final weak verb U root. The R in the past tense with first person, second person, you delete it and replace it with an E. So you would say أنا دعيت أنت دعيت أنت دعيتي نحن دعينا أنتو دعيتو. However, with the third person, that alif or R comes back again. So you would say هو دعا, he invited, هي دعت, she invited, هن دعوا, they invited. What did we notice here? The R got completely deleted with she and with they group of people, and this is something you need to write it down so you could remember it. Again, the R gets replaced with an E with the first person, second person. With the third person, that alif comes back again with he. With she, that R gets replaced and gets deleted completely, such as with she third person and they. On the other hand, with the present tense, the R, you replace it here with an U. Why? Because this is a final weak verb, an U root final weak verb, meaning the R gets replaced with an U or an wow. أنا بدعو أنت بتدعو أنتي بتدعي نحن بندعو أنتو بتدعو هو بيدعو هي بتدعو هن بيدعو. Couple of notes to write it down. Similarly to the final weak E root, the R gets replaced with an wow. And it gets completely replaced with a suffix if that verb has a suffix. And it happens, this verb is an U root. And some of the conjugation, such as you group of people, and they ends with an U, and that sometimes it's either can be considered as a good news or bad news. I would say it's a good news because in a way it helps you to understand it and conjugate it, and it's rather becomes something easy for you to conjugate and remember. All you need to do is to remember with you feminine, because the suffix is an E, I'm afraid you have to delete the U and replace it with an E. So it's say بتدعي. Hey انتي بتدعي, you invite. Let's summarize again. This is a final weak verb, U root, meaning the R, we replace it with an U with all conjugation unless it has a suffix. Therefore, the U will be replaced with the actual suffix, as you see here, which I've highlighted in red. And again, you will have to remember to add your prefix. That's how we distinguish between who we are talking to. Great, and this was the end of our session. A very brief introduction to the present tense, the regular and the irregular, middle week and final week, and some other irregular forms that do not apply in dialect. But I'm afraid they do have their own cases in modern standard Arabic. But luckily for you guys, in dialect, they tend to shorten most of these grammars. And that's why they say dialect is a little bit easier than modern standard Arabic. And with that, I'll end today's session. Hope you enjoyed it and found it helpful and informative. Till next time, stay safe. Ma salame.